With me here on the show today is Dan Kardokus, and he works with a number of different organizations and people with disabilities. And I've asked him to join us today to give us a little insight on what it's like being a person with some sort of disability or other, and what sort of issues and concerns and insights this different perspective has to offer. In discussing what we could talk about on the show today, something that I found very interesting, and you started telling me a little about, is the different, the feelings of persons with disabilities in different settings, that it's not the same across the board. Say someone who is living with a disability in a city as opposed to in a very rural place, or maybe on a farm, as opposed to well, the situation that's kind of across the board, ethnic or orientational associations. You know, even within the gay and lesbian community, for example, different attitudes within the group toward people with disabilities. The way you were commenting, I'm not sure you can comment on this, but the way you were telling me the other day, it sounded like gays and lesbians don't treat gays and lesbians with disabilities the same way that, for example, Native Americans treat Native Americans with disabilities.
Well, each person, you know, brings in their own set of stereotypes. I think that's one of the biggest problems. You know, people within the gay lesbian community ought to understand about stereotypes more than anybody else.
Well, any minority should.
As well, you know, you have the black culture, the Indian culture. In fact, the great big controversy with the redskin emblem in Littleton, I think, or one of the surrounding areas. For a lot of people that are from the Native American culture, it's very offensive. But other people begin saying, well, why do you think it's offensive? We don't take it that way. And it's like there's a lot of history behind a lot of things. People who are coming from the Black American culture, those that are older, remember the civil rights movement. They remember the times that the Harlem Globetrotters had to walk in the back of a hotel or a restaurant, or they had to drink in a different water fountain. And it's amazing that each generation there's a new type of minority that people start trying to point out. And yet it's also within the disability movement. Persons with mobility impairment feel very strongly about barriers, which are things you can see like steps rather than ramps. But then there's persons with visually impairments, or like with a head injury, something that I have a personal first-hand experience on. You have the mild, you have the severe, you have the profoundly head injured, and yet in many cases sometimes the minor or mild is more severe than the word would indicate. And so you have
more severe in the sense of impairment?
Impairment. In my case, I had a severe head injury. And yet sometimes a person that has a mild concussion at times has a longer recovery, or more subtle recovery than anybody else has. And I know there was one girl that she was a straight A student, and she was riding a bike, and she was sideswiped by a car, and she ended up being unconscious for a day, and she was out of the hospital in 2 days. And yet here she was, a straight A student, going down to a straight F student, and within a year she was she had attempted suicide because nobody understood her. Nobody thought, well, maybe it was because you were hit on the head. But she had a minor head injury. She did not have a severe head injury such as I sustained.
Which opens up a whole can of worms, I guess, in terms of how much damage a little bit of ignorance can do?
Oh, well, an awful lot, because first of all, say for instance in the AIDS and HIV community, not only is there sometimes little information, there's a lot of misinformation as well, or there's people that choose to believe the beginnings whenever the epidemic just started coming to the surface, rather than really looking through the whole system. I think a very classic example in '86, when I had my accident and sustained a head injury, 6 months before I had been diagnosed as having HIV positive. And my doctor, who was in charge of an HMO facility, decided that within 6 months I was going to die. I didn't have full-blown AIDS, but I was just positive, so she decided I was going to die. So if I was going to die, why should she bother with any neurological
Is she still in
services?
practice?
She was whenever I left, and this was in Houston, Texas.
That's atrocious.
And the reason why I say that is that she refused, or Cigna, the Cigna healthcare plan refused to pay anything neurologically, as far as, because I had been life-flighted out of their affiliation, which was Herman Hospital. They refused to pay the neurosurgeon after I was released. Then the Texas Institute of Rehabilitation and Rehab was going to work with me, and they refused to pay any of that, because, you know, why should they bother?
I keep, you know, in my wildest dreams, and people tell me that yeah, it's a pretty wild dream. If we could get to some place in the way we run America, where we could make decisions based on obvious questions of health, you know, instead of saying who's going to pay for it, to talk about someone's physical, psychological, emotional health. And, you know, and that's where we're running into another kind of an inherited negative attitude from the way past generations have thought about these things. If it's not a physical injury, it's like it's not really an injury. And yet, you know, as you were just relating, the non-physical or the non-obvious injuries in the long run seem to do the most damage.
According to my voc rehab counselor, Roger Anderson, in Durango, Colorado, he stated that between 85 and 90% of disabilities are non-visual. That means that they're not in, you know, we see the person in the wheelchair.
The person walks in the room and you don't know. How do you respond to a person now? I mean, or how would you like people to respond? You walk into a room and they haven't got a clue. Is there any way, you know, without making an issue of it, but just being informational or being friendly?
It depends.
How do you deal with situations like that?
It depends on that person. And, you know, one thing that is very important too is family teaching of how to deal with disabilities have a very strong impact. Say, for instance, if I know of one person I used to work with, profoundly developmentally disabled in California, and there was one man, there was one of my kids, he was 17 years old, had a mentality of 6 months, but he was one of the most enjoyable kids around. His father, within a year and a half, came to visit him. All he could talk about was, well, if Leslie was normal, he would have been a football star. He would have been this, he would have been that. And it was like, you know, hey, listen. What a
terrible thing to say about someone, though.
But they do that all the time. Another person said that she could not come to see her son because the doctor had said he was going to be dead when he was 12 years old. She couldn't come in bearing the thought of seeing somebody dying. And so you have those types of situations. Then in my case, I don't look disabled, I don't act disabled. I had a very good example. I was working in Fort Lewis College on an Enabling the Disabled conference. I was the Disabled Student Union, and I was getting all this conference worked out. One of the the person that was in charge of that, she looked at me and she says, well, Dan, she says, I'd like to know, why are you so involved with all the disability issues around town?
She didn't know you.
And, right. And I said, well, I'm disabled. Her mouth dropped. Her eyes got wide. And she said, you're too happy to be disabled.
All disabled people are upset and sad and angry, or what? Going back to the comment you made a few minutes ago, I'm getting to the point where I really hate the word normal, because it seems that people use it as this thing to slap people into boxes and to decide good or bad. It is good to be normal, it is bad not to be normal, but who's deciding what's normal in the first place? And I very much resent someone deciding that I'm bad because I don't meet their standard. And maybe this man's son was never supposed to be a football player.
Well, another thing that is so, I believe, is behind a lot of the disability. A lot of families say, well, we have to keep them behind. That's why we find people, even today, that keep their kids in closets that are disabled. And we've heard about that in the last couple of years. We've heard about, we had in Colorado Springs where that young boy was burned to death because he was locked in the house. Because they didn't want him to get out. They didn't want to have him, seeing things. I know of one man that when he was in school, had cerebral palsy, very intelligent, and he told about a time that he was, his school at Farmington, New Mexico was going on a trip, and the teacher actually put him in this wheelchair in a closet and shut the door and left, and was gone for almost the whole day. And during that time, here he is in a dark room and the fire bell alarm goes off and nobody knew that he was there. Here he was sitting in the darkness wondering whether or not he was going to be burned to death. And what was even harder was the same teacher who continually has systematically abused persons with disabilities throughout this person's tenure.
Never been reprimanded?
No. And parents are afraid to even come up and say anything because they're afraid that that teacher is going to put retribution on their children for, I know, but you see a lot of people do that.
Somehow there has got to be an answer, though. I mean, to me, this cannot continue. I guess recognizing there's going to be prejudice and bad teachers, bad doctors, bad people in whatever place. Somehow, I just know that I need to set a different example than that.
Well, one thing that I think spirituality is very important too, because I think that a disability brings a person up very aware of how mortal they are. In my case, I clocked out of work at 11 o'clock at night. I was planning on going home. I was a father of 2 kids. And I had the whole next day planned of what I was going to do, not only church, but everything else. I never made it home. I clocked out of work, and the next thing I knew, I was hit by a truck from behind. It was hit and run, so I laid in a ditch for 6 hours before they even found me. And a disability can happen to any person, any place, regardless of sex, regardless of age, regardless of ethnic morality, and not only that, but sexual orientation.
And that's the thing to remember too, that a lot of people living with disabilities were not born with them.
And if they've been brought up being a little bit afraid of the disability, if their parents have, I keep on thinking about this one story I'd heard where this mother receives a call from her son who was a Vietnam veteran, in Vietnam, and he calls up and he says, "Mom, I'm stateside, I want to come home." She says, "Sure, Johnny, I'm really glad that you're coming home." He says, "Well, Mom, I want to bring a friend with me." he has one arm and one leg from a mine explosion. There's silence, and the mother says, well, maybe some other time, Johnny. You just come home. The next day, she receives another phone call. Her son that night had committed suicide.
Because he was the one?
Because he was the one with the one leg and one arm. And family members don't realize that their acceptance, and friends, if you become disabled, a lot of times people automatically think that your IQ goes down. And sometimes it takes a long time getting up. In my case, with a head injury, you work back up to where you once was. You may never get that way like you used to be.
Do you think it might also be that our society has not taught us how to deal with differences? You know, that when someone walks into the room who's not just like us, that our society has taught us to pretend that they are. And that's where it can get real hard when you're dealing with something, you know, someone with missing limbs. You know, instead of just saying, oh, you have missing limbs, and he'd say, yes, I do.
But you know,
now that we got that covered.
The thing that's so amazing about that is that persons don't realize within their own groups. You know, let's take the gay and lesbian issues right now.
Mm-hmm.
A friend of mine was talking to me yesterday, and he said, you know, I said, what do you want me to say on the show? And he says, well, one thing I would like people to realize is a person with disabilities is not asexual.
Mm.
And he told experience of a gay friend of his came up and says, boy, I'd really like to talk to so-and-so over there, you know, he's really cute looking, you know. Too bad he's disabled. And he's saying, so what's the big problem with that? Just because
he doesn't have a tongue, he can't talk?
You know, and you know, people don't realize that. Another issue is that other minorities have a problem accepting disabilities or even the gay and lesbian issues within their cultures. It's really hard. You would think that people that have been discriminated against in history would understand other person's discrimination and work with that, but they don't.
But we all have unique perspectives. We were talking earlier, and you're mentioning, for example, that someone who has a hearing impairment looks at another person, and something that just drives them up the wall is people with mustaches because they can't lip read. And which to me is very interesting. I never thought about that. You know, and it's all kinds of subtle little things like that. I guess, to me, a lot of it comes back to this, the psychological phenomena that some people call the elephant in the living room. Mm-hmm. Everyone's trying so hard to be normal that they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to address it, they don't want to understand it, they don't want to get close to it. They just keep walking around the elephant in the living room, pretending it's not there, instead of just embracing a very freeing kind of honesty.
That's true. And another thing that I feel too is that with disabilities, a lot of times people honestly start thinking about, well, you must have done something really bad to, you know, have situations, and I keep on thinking about
God
this.
is punishing you or something?
Right, and I think of this. I think of the scripture where the disciples are talking to Jesus, and they see this blind person. And he says, "Who sinned, his parents or this man?" And Jesus turned around and says, "Neither. This is for the glory of God." Mm-hmm. And I had to really wrestle with that myself. I come from a Pentecostal background, mm-hmm. and of course divine healing, you know, and I have come a long way, but I still have disabilities. My mother once says, well, you just have to stop thinking that you're disabled, and I'm trying to say, well, you can't just jump in and out of disability.
Is this like self-hypnosis? If I don't believe in it, it's not there?
Well, a lot of people think that you can, you know. Johnny Erickson talks about how so many people began to really pray with her, and, well, if you only had faith, you would be able to walk out of that chair.
And this is a whole nother discussion.
But you see, what I'm saying is that person has a lot of unique qualities.
Yeah, and
that
to me,
makes
that's what it comes down with everyone. Whoever walks in the door, regardless of what shape, what color, if they have antennae, if they're from Mars, start by getting to know them.
Mm-hmm.
Just being honest, and if it's an uncomfortable situation, maybe it'll help just to say that. I realize I'm uncomfortable with this, but I'd like to get to know you.
And don't be afraid of asking questions. Another thing that I keep on saying, that a lot of people say, well, there's some people that are so angry with disabilities. Sometimes a person is angry because they've faced so many barriers for so long. And, then they say, well, why are we now being forced to, with the Americans with Disabilities Act, to become accessible within the workplace, within the local establishments? Well, the reason
I would
why...
say it's to your benefit.
Oh, yeah.
These are people, that don't fit your typical description, perhaps, but they have a lot to offer, and I think you should get to know them.
There are 43 million Americans with a disability. According to the Rocky Mountain Regional Brain Injury Center's statistics, 2 million people a year
become disabled.
No, I'm not talking about that.
No.
They just become disabled with a head injury. That's just one disability group. That's 2 million a year. Think about all the other disabilities.
Which, those are big numbers, and it's impressive to hear big numbers, but I guess the thing we try to keep coming back to on the show, you read things in the paper about people groups, and it's like you blow it off because there's no way to respond to 2 million people.
Until somebody in your family or a friend of yours is very close becomes disabled.
And that's the part we need to find out about, is when you have the privilege to meet a disabled person face to face. How do you respond to that? How do you make them feel included? How do you make them feel like they're a valuable person, and that they're not stupid just because they have a disability?
Number one, talk to them. There's so many times that if a person in a wheelchair or a person with a cane comes in to a restaurant with another person, you'll watch and see the waiters or the waitresses will automatically start talking to the person that is not disabled. And they will talk over that person instead of talking directly to that person and saying, what would you like? I'm one of these that when I see a person that is disabled, I will go up and talk with that person, because a lot of times they're not talked to. Person with AIDS, it's a very important issue there. They're starting to come, and sometimes they have to come out and say that they have AIDS or there's some problems, and immediately people start shying away. They're afraid to touch them. They're afraid, without realizing.
See, now I had the reverse experience, and it puzzles me to this day, and the best I can figure is that it was a problem in their own, in them being honest with themselves, that they were not able to really be so. That was 2, possibly 3 people I can think of right off the top of my head, who I was just being a friend to, and we got to some point in the conversation where it was the next obvious thing to say, well, I'm positive, or I have AIDS, or I have AIDS, and my T-cell count is low enough that I can't be employed anymore, whatever. And it was the last time I saw them, because my response was, okay, like, what is that supposed to mean? Because to me it wasn't really relevant. I was still looking at a person I thought was friendly, I thought was nice, and okay, I'll bear that in mind, but I don't know, I can't figure out how it's supposed to mean that I treat you any differently than I have been.
Well, and you see, that's one thing that persons with AIDS or that are HIV positive really are yearning for. Just last week, somebody was talking to me and said, well, should a person that's negative go with a person that's positive? And I started talking to him. I says, well, what is the underlying? And he said, I've been really struggling because there's just one person that fits into everything that I really want But he's positive. And I says, well, I said, first of all, just because you're positive does not mean that you're going to have AIDS. Not only that, but...
And there's no guarantee that you're going to outlive him.
Right. Because you may get killed by a truck.
Yeah, well, you know, life is an unpredictable place to live.
And so I told him that he's robbing himself of meeting the person that maybe is the ideal person for him, because he fits everything else, looks, whatever, I guess.
You know, in the end, I think I would rather have a single year of really good memories than to have never known a person. You know, just because I couldn't have longer than that.
Yeah, you see, that's a real important issue, I think. People look at the barriers of things.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, but I'm real glad you were able to come join us today, and I really appreciated the things you shared. Perhaps we can have you back again sometime and continue this discussion. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And now may you be blessed with love and peace in the pursuit of your own dreams and in all your dealings with the diversity of humanity around you. Amen.